A football field can look ordinary until someone steps onto it carrying a whole life of failure, belief, shame, memory, and impossible hope. That is the strange magic of Shaolin soccer. On the surface, it is loud, silly, explosive, cartoonish, and proudly ridiculous. It is a film where bodies fly through the air like comets, where a football can move like a weapon, where a goalkeeper can become something close to a myth, and where the rules of reality seem to bend because the joke demands it. But here is the thing about this film. Beneath all that comic exaggeration, beneath the wild faces and impossible kicks, there is something unexpectedly sincere beating at the center. Welcome to the Cineflux. And if you are here, I think you already understand that cinema does not always need to be quiet in order to be meaningful. Sometimes meaning comes through silence. Sometimes it comes through a close up, a shadow, a tiny gesture, but sometimes meaning comes through a ball tearing through the air with the force of a spiritual awakening. Sometimes a film tells you the truth by making the impossible feel emotionally obvious. That is what we are sitting with today. Shaolin Soccer is not a film that asks you to admire it from a distance. It runs toward you, it shouts, it trips over itself, it smiles with missing teeth. It believes in its own madness so completely that after a while you stop asking whether any of this could happen and start asking why it feels so good that it does. And that question matters. Because comedy, when it is done lazily, can become only noise. But comedy, when it is shaped by pain and hunger and longing, becomes something much more powerful. It becomes release. It becomes rebellion. It becomes a way for ordinary people to imagine themselves larger than the world that has ignored them. What struck me most about returning to this film is how deeply it cares about people who have been dismissed. The broken men, the forgotten friends, the workers, the dreamers who became tired, the people who once had fire inside them, then slowly learned to hide it because life kept teaching them that fire was embarrassing. And into that world comes Singh, a man who believes howling kung fu should not be locked away as some ancient memory. He believes it belongs in everyday life. In walking, working, parking cars, making food, fixing problems, surviving humiliation, he sees beauty where everyone else sees foolishness. He sees purpose where everyone else sees failure. Think about what that means. This is a comedy about football, yes. It is also a martial arts fantasy. It is also a sports underdog story. But underneath all of that, it is about the painful gap between who people want to become and who the world allowed them to be. It is about rediscovering the part of yourself you abandoned because it seemed too unrealistic to protect. And maybe that is why the film still has such a strange warmth. It is not polished in the way modern blockbusters often try to be polished. It has rough edges, it has chaotic energy. It sometimes moves like a live action cartoon that has escaped the beach before anyone could catch it. But those rough edges are part of its personality. They are part of its pulse. This film is not trying to be elegant, it is trying to be alive. Cinema rarely does this with such fearless innocence. It takes a joke and pushes it until it becomes myth. It takes a loser and frames him like a legend before the world has agreed to see him that way. It takes sport, kung fu, romance, shame, friendship, and absurdity, then throws them into the same storm until something joyful comes flying out. And joy is not a small thing, especially not the kind of joy this film offers, not empty joy, not polished joy, not the kind that pretends life is simple. This is joy that comes after embarrassment, after being laughed at, after being poor, after being overlooked, after trying to explain your dream to people who only know how to measure what is practical. That is why, even when Shaolin soccer is at its most ridiculous, it never feels hollow to me. The exaggeration is not a decoration, it is the emotional language of the film. These characters do not just want to win a game, they want to feel for one impossible moment that the universe has noticed them, and maybe that is why sports stories endure. At their best, they are never really about the sport, they are about dignity. They are about a group of people stepping onto a field carrying every private defeat with them, then discovering that failure was not the end of the story, it was only the beginning of the comeback. So today, we are not just looking at Shaolin Soccer as a cult comedy or Stephen Chow classic or a wild early 2000s martial arts sports fantasy. We are looking at what this film understands about belief, about humiliation, about teamwork, about the comic beauty of people who refuse to stay small. And before we step fully into the film itself, before we talk about its characters, its chaos, its strange emotional honesty, and the way it turns football into a spiritual battlefield, we need to begin with the word that created it, because Shaolin soccer did not arrive from nowhere. It came from a particular moment in cinema, a particular cultural energy, and a particular hunger for something that could be both local and universal, both deeply Hong Kong and instantly understandable anywhere. To understand why this film hit the way it did, we have to look first at the world waiting for it. At the beginning of the 2000s, Hong Kong cinema was standing in a strange and tender place. It had already given the world so much. The speed of Jackie Chan, the tragic cool of John Woo, the neon loneliness of Wong Kar-wai, the operatic violence, the street comedy, the martial arts grace, the impossible mix of commercial instinct and artistic electricity. For years, Hong Kong had not just made films, it had made motion feel like personality. It had made genre feel like a living language. But by the time Shaolin Soccer arrived in 2001, that word was no longer as certain as it had once been. The golden rush of the 80s and early 90s had slowed. Production and investment had fallen after the boom years, with the Asian financial crisis and piracy often named among the pressures that weakened the industry's old engine. And that context matters because Shaolin Soccer does not feel like a film made from a place of defeat. It feels like a film shouting back at defeat. Think about emotional weather around it. Hong Kong cinema had spent years teaching the world how beautiful movement could be. Then suddenly the industry was being asked to survive in a changed marketplace against Hollywood imports, shifting regional audiences, new distribution patterns, and a sense that the old certainty had cracked. It would have been easy, in that moment, to become smaller, to become cautious, to imitate whatever seemed safest. Stephen Chow did almost the opposite. He made a film that feels like someone took every supposedly uncool thing, slapstick sincerity, underdogs, impossible kung fu, sports movie cliches, broken friendships, low status workers, big facial reactions, digital exaggeration, and decided they were not weaknesses, they were fuel. That is part of why Shaolin Soccer feels so alive. It arrives from a cinema culture under pressure, but it does not respond with despair. It responds with invention. It says, what if the answer to shrinking expectations is not realism, but imagination? What if the ordinary person does not need to be made ordinary just because the world has treated him that way? In Hong Kong, the film was not a small curiosity. It became a phenomenon. Its knockout box office reached more than $60 million, making it the highest grossing film in Hong Kong history at that time, before Chow's own Kung Fu Hustle later surpassed it. Worldwide, it grossed more than $42 million, which is not just a number, but evidence of how far its absurd emotional language could travel. And here is what I keep returning to, that success was not built on seriousness. It was built on permission. The film gave people permission to laugh at bodies that refused to behave realistically. Permission to cheer for losers without irony. Permission to watch Kung Fu leave the temple, leave the costume drama, leave the solemn training hall, and crash directly into daily life. It took something culturally rooted and made it ridiculous without making it cheap. That balance is delicate. If you make the tradition too sacred, the comedy cannot breathe. If you make the comedy too careless, the tradition loses its soul. Shaolin Soccer dances in the space between both. This is why its reception is so interesting. It was not just embraced as a popular comedy. It was recognized by the Hong Kong Film Awards in a major way, winning Best Picture, Best Director for Stephen Chow, Best Actor for Chow, and Best Supporting Actor for Wong Yet-fei among its victories. That tells us something. The film may look from the outside like pure nonsense, but the industry saw craft inside the nonsense. It saw timing, it saw control, it saw a filmmaker who understood that absurdity becomes powerful when it is built with emotional architecture, because this is not random chaos. Stephen Chow's comedy often works by pushing a ridiculous idea so far that it curves back into feeling. A person is humiliated, then exaggerated. A dream is mocked, then mythologized. A joke begins as foolishness, then suddenly reveals loneliness underneath. This is what makes his style difficult to copy. The joke is never only the joke is a door, and in 2001 that door opened to a world beyond Hong Kong in a fascinating way. For many international viewers, Shaolin Soccer did not arrive like a normal foreign release. It traveled through festival curiosity, DVDs, word of mouth clips, fan communities, and, in some places, unofficial online circulation before broader theatrical access caught up. We had reported in 2003 that the film had become one of the unexpected titles people were seeking through file sharing networks while still unreleased in the United States. which says something important about demand. People were not waiting politely for the industry to explain why they should care. They were already curious. And maybe that is the perfect second life for this movie. A film about hidden talent became a hidden talent film itself. A film about overlooked people found overlooked before. A film about a team nobody takes seriously became one of those titles people passed around with the energy of discovery, saying, "You have to see this, because I cannot explain it properly." That phrase matters, "I cannot explain it properly." Some films are easy to summarize and hard to feel. Shaolin soccer is the reverse. The premise sounds almost too simple. Kung Fu masters use their skills to play football. But the experience is bigger than the premise because the film belongs to a very specific emotional tradition. It belongs to Hong Kong action comedy, to martial arts cinema, to sports underdog storytelling, to the early digital effects era, to Stephen Chow's more layered Chow absurdist rhythm, and to a post Golden Age industry still trying to prove that it could surprise the world again. It also belongs to something even older, the dream that discipline can become joy. Shaolin Kung Fu in cultural imagination often carries ideas of training, restraint, control, body and spirit moving as one. Football, by contrast, is public, messy, collective, emotional, and open to chaos. The genius of the film is not simply that it combines them, the genius is that it understands how compatible they are. Both are about timing, both are about the body, both are about faith in movement before the result is guaranteed. That is why the film's ridiculousness never fully disconnects from beauty. The bone may become impossible. The kicks may become supernatural. The players may look like cartoons brought into real streets. But underneath that exaggeration is a serious idea. A human being becomes most alive when a forgotten skill finally finds its purpose. This is also why the film feels both perfectly of its time and strangely timeless. It is very early 2000s in its visual effects, its editing rhythms, its tonal boldness, its willingness to let digital images look stylized rather than invisible. You can feel the era in it. You can feel the moment when Asian popular cinema was experimenting with computer generated exaggeration not to hide reality, but to make comic fantasy more explosive. It does not have the smoothness of later superhero imagery. It has something stranger and, in some ways, more charming, effects that feel like drawings of emotions. But the emotional engine beneath those effects has not aged in the same way. Being underestimated has not aged. Wanting dignity has not aged. Feeling ridiculous for believing in something has not aged. Wanting your gifts to matter in a world that keeps asking for practical usefulness, that has not aged at all. And so Shaolin Soccer stands in cinema history as more than a cult favorite. It is a reminder that popular cinema can be deeply generous. It can take the language of a city, the traditions of a culture, the structure of a sports film, and the heart of a comedy, then send all of it flying toward a global audience without smoothing away its personality. That is rare, because many films become international by becoming less specific. Shaolin Soccer becomes international by being aggressively, joyfully itself. It does not apologize for its rhythm. It does not explain every cultural texture until the life drains out. It trusts that if the feeling is clear enough, you will follow the ball. And you do. You follow it because the film was born from a world that knew both pressure and possibility. A world where cinema had already been heroic, wounded, commercial, poetic, chaotic, and brilliant. A world where Stephen Chow could look at a damaged industry, a familiar sport, an ancient martial tradition, and a group of forgotten people, and somehow see not nostalgia, but ignition. So when Shaolin Soccer begins, it is not just beginning a joke, it is beginning a comeback. Shaolin Soccer is a 2001 Hong Kong martial arts sports comedy directed by Stephen Chow, who also stars as Singh, the wandering Shaolin believer, at the center of the story. Alongside him, the film brings in Man-Tat as Golden Leg Fung, Zhao as Moe, Patrick C. as Dean Evil's calculating owner, and a group of performers who make the film feel less like a clean ensemble and more like a collection of wounded comic spirits being gathered back into motion. And that is important because this film does not introduce itself like a polished sports drama. It does not stand neatly at the edge of the field and ask you to take it seriously first. It throws you into a world where humiliation is physical, comedy is emotional, and every ordinary street corner seems like it could suddenly become a stage for impossible movement. The genre is easy to name and difficult to contain. It is a football film, it is a kung fu film, it is a slapstick comedy, it is an underdog story, it is a fantasy of self belief, but those labels only explain the ingredients. They do not explain the flavor. At its heart, Shaolin soccer is about a man who still believes in something everyone else has abandoned. Singh believes Shaolin Kung Fu has a place in modern life, not as decoration, not as museum culture, not as something trapped in memory or legend. He believes it can make ordinary people stronger, more graceful, more useful, more alive. The world around him sees that belief as childish. People laugh at him, they dismiss him. They look at him the way practical people often look at dreamers, with irritation, pity, or amusement. But the Finn does something beautiful with that. It does not make him powerful because he is already respected. It makes him powerful because he refuses to let disrespect define the size of his inner world. That is the emotional engine. Gordon Lev Fung enters the film carrying a different kind of wound. He was once connected to greatness, but his life has been bent by betrayal, regret, and the cruelty of a single ruined chance. Where Singh represents belief before success, Fang represents talent after collapse. One man still looks forward with absurd hope. The other keeps looking backward at the moment everything broke. And when these two energies meet, the film finds its shape. The story becomes about building a football team out of forgotten Shaolin brothers, men who once trained their bodies and spirits toward mastery but have since been swallowed by ordinary life. Some are working hard, some are ashamed, some have let themselves go, some have hidden their gifts so deeply that even they can barely remember what it felt like to be extraordinary. That idea could have become sentimental in a weaker film, but Stephen Chow understands that embarrassment is often the doorway to sincerity. Before these men can become inspiring, they are allowed to be ridiculous. Before they can become heroic, they are allowed to be weak. Before the film asks you to cheer for them, it lets you laugh at them, and sometimes at the absurd situation they are trapped inside. But the laughter is not cold. That matters. Chow's vision has always been tied to the dignity of foolish people, or maybe more accurately, people who look foolish because the world has not learned how to see them properly. In his cinema, the clown is often closer to truth than the respectable person. The poor, the mocked, the awkward, the broken, they carry the secret energy of the story. You feel that in Shaolin Soccer from the beginning. Its word is not realistic in the narrow sense. It is emotionally exaggerated. Every insult lands bigger. Every kick travels farther. Every failure becomes more theatrical. Every comeback feels like a miracle that has been waiting behind a joke. And then there is Moi. Moi's presence changes the emotional texture of the film. She is quiet where the rest of the movie is loud. She works with dough, with touch, with rhythm, with patience. Her kung fu is not introduced through spectacle in the same way. It is hidden inside daily labor, inside a skill nobody has been taught to admire. Through her, the film deepens one of its central ideas. Greatness does not always announce itself. Sometimes it is folded into survival, sometimes it is covered in flour, sometimes it is standing right in front of people who are too distracted to recognize it. That is why, spoiler free, I do think Shaolin Soccer is worth watching. Not because every joke lands perfectly, not because every effect has aged cleanly, and not because the film is flawless. It is worth watching because it has a rare relationship with joy. It believes joy can be messy. It believes confidence can be rebuilt. It believes talent can return after years of silence. It believes the body can remember what the heart has forgotten, and cinema rarely tries what this film attempts with such fearless innocence. It wants to make you laugh, but it also wants to restore something in you. It wants to turn a game into a battlefield of dignity. It wants to show that a team is not just a group of players trying to win. Sometimes a team is a group of people giving each other permission to become impossible again. That is the world Shaolin soccer inhabits, a world where kung fu is not only combat, a world where football is not only sport, a world where the most ridiculous dream in the room may be the only one powerful enough to save everybody. When I first sat with this film, I expected something loud. And to be fair, Shaolin soccer gives you loudness almost immediately. It gives you faces stretched into comic extremes, bodies thrown into humiliation, music that knows when to swell with absurd seriousness, and a world where nobody seems capable of entering a scene quietly if chaos is available instead. But what I did not expect, at least not at first, was how quickly the film's silliness would start to feel like emotional protection. That is the thing about the opening feeling of Shaolin soccer. It comes at you as a comedy, but there is hurt underneath the joke. Not heavy, tragic hurt. Not the kind of pain the film wants to trap you inside. More like the bruised feeling of people who have been laughed at so many times that laughter has become part of their clothing. They wear it because they have no choice. They turn embarrassment into rhythm because dignity is harder to hold on to when the world keeps pulling it away. The first atmosphere of the film is not really realism. It is public humiliation turned into cartoon movement. People are mocked, people are pushed aside, past glory is treated like something useless. Belief is treated like a social mistake. And Singh moves through all of this with that strange, stubborn brightness of someone who either cannot see how ridiculous he looks or has decided that looking ridiculous is not the worst thing a person can be. That struck me. Because we often talk about underdog stories as if they begin with weakness. But Shaolin soccer begins with something more specific than weakness. It begins with social embarrassment, the shame of being poor, the shame of being ignored, the shame of still believing in something everyone else considers outdated, the shame of having a dream that does not fit neatly into the modern world. And the film's opening understands that shame can be funny from the outside and painful from the inside. Stephen Chow placing with a comic looseness that makes him seem almost weightless at first. He is not introduced like a conventional hero waiting for destiny. He is awkward, intense, strange, and deeply inconvenient to ordinary life. He talks about Shaolin Kung Fu as if it is the answer to everything, and the world around him responds with the tired impatience of people who have bills to pay, work to do, and no time for spiritual salesmanship. But what this film understands is that obsession can be beautiful when it comes from longing. Singh is not simply trying to prove that he is special. He is trying to prove that what shaped him still has value. He wants Shaolin not to be forgotten. He wants the old discipline to enter daily life, to help people, to matter again. And beneath the comedy, that desire has a surprisingly pure sadness. Imagine carrying something precious inside you and realizing that the world has no category for it anymore. That is where the film quietly hooks you. The opening scenes do not ask you to admire Singh yet. They ask you to notice that he has not surrendered. There is a difference. Admiration comes later, after the film has built the myth. But at first, what we see is persistence without reward, faith without applause, a man still speaking the language of possibility in a world that keeps answering in practical disappointment. And then Golden Leg Fung enters that emotional space, like a warning from the future. Where Singh is still burning with belief, Fung has already been burned by it. He carries the energy of someone who once had a name, a gift, a future, and then lost the right to stand inside his own story. In him, the film gives us not just a coach figure, but a human reminder of what happens when talent becomes tied to regret. He is not simply looking for success. He is trying to return to a moment before humiliation became permanent. So, from the very beginning, Shaolin Soccer creates a fascinating emotional contrast. One man has too much belief, one man has almost none left. One sees a future where Kung Fu can live again. The other sees the past as a wound that refuses to close. And between them, football becomes more than a game. It becomes the unlikely place where both men might find a way back to themselves. The atmosphere then is comic, yes, but also restless. You can feel the film searching for ignition. Every joke seems to push the characters toward a larger transformation. Every absurd moment feels like the film testing how much reality it can bend before something deeper appears through the crack. And that is what made my first encounter with it different from what I came in expecting. I expected a white sports comedy. I found a film about people trying to become visible again. That does not mean the movie suddenly becomes quiet or delicate. It does not. It keeps its big gestures. It keeps its broad humor. It keeps its impossible physics. But once you begin to feel the loneliness inside the comedy, the entire film changes shape. The ridiculousness becomes less random. The exaggeration starts to feel like the only language big enough for these characters' buried hunger, because ordinary realism would almost be too small for them. How do you realistically show a man who believes his forgotten discipline can still save lives? How do you realistically show a fallen athlete trying to recover his soul through a sport that once destroyed him? How do you realistically show a group of broken brothers remembering that their bodies once carried grace? You do not make it realistic. You make it fly, and that is the first spell Shaolin soccer casts. It teaches you how to watch it. It asks you to stop measuring the fin by the rules of the physical world and start measuring it by emotional truth. If humiliation feels enormous, the comedy becomes enormous. If hope feels impossible, the football must become impossible too. By the time the fin begins gathering its steam, you are no longer watching only for jokes, you are watching for recovery. You are watching to see whether these scattered, dismissed, half forgotten people can remember the shape of their own power. And that is where the story begins to move from comedy into something strangely moving. The story of Shaolin soccer begins with a simple emotional wound. A man who once belonged to greatness has been forced to live in the shadow of his own humiliation. Golden Leg Fung is not introduced as someone who merely failed. He is introduced as someone whose failure became his identity. That distinction matters. Failure can be survived when it remains an event. But when the world keeps repeating it back to you, when your name becomes attached to the worst day of your life, when even your own memory refuses to let you move forward, failure becomes a room you cannot leave. And Shaolin Soccer understands that before it becomes a story about winning, it has to be a story about people who have forgotten how to stand upright inside themselves. Fung's past hangs over the film like a bruise. He once had talent, status, and a future. Then betrayal and public disgrace broke something in him. Years later, he is not simply older, he is spiritually bent. He walks beneath a man who once had ruined him, and that relationship gives the film an early taste of cruelty. Not loud cruelty, not dramatic cruelty, the colder kind. The cruelty of someone powerful, allowing someone wounded to remain close just to remind him who won. Into this bitterness comes Singh, who moves through the world as if shame has not fully learned how to stop him. Singh is poor, strange, and endlessly mocked. He believes Shaolin Kung Fu should be everywhere, that it can improve daily life, that it can turn ordinary motion into grace. He does not speak about it like a hobby. He speaks our limit. To most people aren't. This makes a ridiculous. To me, it makes one necessary. Because he is the one character who has not accepted the word's definition of usefulness. At first, his dream has no shape that anyone can understand. He wants to promote Shaolin Kung Fu, but he has no platform, no money, no real plan, and no social power. His belief is enormous, but it has nowhere to go. That is why the arrival of football matters. Football gives his belief a field. It gives his philosophy a visible form. It turns an abstract dream into a game people already understand. Fung sees something in him, though not instantly in the pure sentimental way a different film might present it. At first, there is calculation, there is curiosity, there is curiosity. Fung sees that Singh's kick is not ordinary. He sees that this strange man's body contains a kind of force that football could translate into victory. But beneath that practical recognition, something deeper begins. Fung is not just discovering the player. He is discovering the possibility that his own ruined relationship with football might not be finished. This is where the film begins to gather its emotional pieces. Singh goes back to find his old Howlin brothers, and the story becomes a journey through disappointment. Each brother is introduced not as a heroic master waiting in secret, but as someone life has reduced. Their gifts have been buried under work, exhaustion, appetite, shame, family duty, or simple resignation. The film treats this with comedy, but it is comedy with a mournful shape. You laugh because the contrast is absurd. Men once trained in extraordinary disciplines, now trapped in small, ordinary roles. But the sadness is real. They have not only lost their powers, they have lost the belief that their powers still belong to them. That is one of the most quietly affecting ideas in the film. Talent does not always disappear because people stop having it. Sometimes talent disappears because life convinces people it is embarrassing to use. Sometimes the word makes your gift feel impractical. Sometimes survival is so demanding that extraordinarily part of you goes silent, not because it is dead, but because nobody has called its name in years. Sing calls their names, not gently always, not perfectly. Sometimes he is pushy, strange, and comic in the way he refuses to let the past stay buried. But his insistence becomes the kind of rough love. He sees his brothers not as they currently appear, but as they once were and might be again. And even if he annoys them, even if they resist him, even if they become cynical, the fact that someone still remembers their greatness begins to matter. This is the emotional rhythm of the first major stretch of the film. One person's impossible belief slowly infecting people who have made peace with disappointment. The team does not come together cleanly. That would betray the spirit of the movie. They stumble into shape. They resist. They embarrass themselves. They look nothing like champions. And this is where Stephen Chow's comic instincts become essential. He understands that the underdog story works best when dignity is not handed to the characters too soon. If they became impressive immediately, the comeback would feel cheap. Instead, the film lets them look foolish. It lets them be out of practice. It lets their bodies carry the years they have lost. And then slowly, the old skills begin to return. The beauty of this return is not subtle, but it is sincere. A movement appears where there was clumsiness. A kick becomes more than a kick. A defensive action becomes an echo of running. A player who seemed useless begins to reveal the hidden logic of his body. The football field becomes a place where forgotten identities reawaken one by one. That is why the story feels character driven and word driven at the same time. It is character driven because every major movement depends on wounded people choosing to believe again. Singh has to keep trusting his dream even when more. Fung has to confront the sport that destroyed him. The brothers have to recover buried parts of themselves. Moi has to learn that her quiet grace is not something to hide from the world. But the film is also world driven because the universe of Shaolin soccer operates by emotional physics. In this world, inner belief becomes outward force, shame becomes slapstick, discipline becomes spectacle, a football match becomes a moral landscape. The story moves the way it does because the film is not interested in realistic escalation. It is interested in emotional escalation. Every match becomes bigger because the characters are not simply facing stronger opponents, they are facing stronger versions of the world's disbelief. At first, people laugh because the team looks ridiculous. Then people fear them because the impossible begins happening in public. Then the game itself becomes a stage where talent, corruption, discipline, and cruelty all collide. The pacing reflects that truth. The film begins in broken spaces, streets, small rooms, places where people seem trapped in the ordinary. Then it moves outward toward crowds, stadiums, public attention, and meets. That movement matters. It is not just visual scale, it is emotional scale. The characters begin hidden and end up exposed. They begin as jokes and become a spectacle the world cannot ignore. And through all of this, Moe remains one of the film's softest counterpoints. Her story does not move with the same loud rhythm as the men's football journey. She exists in a quieter register. She makes food. She shapes dough. She uses her skill with a tenderness that the world around her does not fully value. Singh recognizes something extraordinary in her movement, but even his recognition is imperfect, filtered through his own eccentric obsession with Shaolin. Moi's emotional journey is about being seen and not quite being seen at the same time. That is painfully human. Sometimes people notice your talent before they notice your heart. Sometimes they admire what you can do before they understand what it costs you to keep doing it. Moi's connection with sin carries that awkward ache. It is sweet, strange, and sometimes uncomfortable because the film is dealing with characters who do not know how to express tenderness cleanly. Their emotional language is clumsy. But within that clumsiness, there is a fragile sincerity. She sees Sin not simply as a fool, but as someone whose belief might include her. He sees her not simply as a worker, but as someone whose ordinary gestures contain hidden mastery. They are both people whose gifts have been covered by social judgment, his by poverty and ridicule, hers by appearance, shyness, and invisibility. And that connection deepens the story's larger idea. The world is full of people who are more than they are allowed to appear. As the team enters competition, the film begins using football as a kind of comic revelation machine. Every opponent helps reveal something about the Shaolin team. Some matches expose their raw force, some expose their lack of discipline, some expose the absurd gap between ordinary sport and spiritualized movement. But the important thing is that the team starts learning how to become collective. At first, Singh's belief is individual. He carries it like a torch nobody asked for. But football forces that belief to become shared. A single gifted player is not enough. A single kick cannot heal every wound. The brothers must trust each other's bodies, timing, instincts, and flaws. Fung must guide without simply using them as tools for his revenge. Singh must learn that spreading Shaolin is not about making people admire him. It is about awakening something larger than himself. That is where the film's sports structure becomes emotionally useful. Training, matches, setbacks, victories, these are familiar beats. We know this kind of story. We can feel the shape of the underdog climb before it fully happens. But Shaolin Soccer keeps refreshing that familiarity through exaggeration. It takes the expected sports movie moments and inflates them until they become almost mythic. A save is not just a save. A shot is not just a shot. A team formation is not just strategy. Everything becomes a physical expression of belief returning to the body. And because the film is funny, it never becomes too heavy under its own meaning. That balance is part of its charm. A more solemn version of the story might have crushed the joy out of it. A purely silly version might have lost the emotional root. But Shaolin Soccer keeps moving between both. It lets you laugh at the absurdity, then quietly asks you to care about the wound beneath it. It lets a moment be ridiculous and inspiring at the same time. It knows that life often feels exactly like that, embarrassing while it is happening, meaningful when you look back. The deeper the theme goes, the more the film begins to sharpen its contrast between pure play and corrupted power. On one side, you have Singh and his brothers, who are chaotic, flawed, poor, and strange, but whose power comes from discipline, memory, and shared recovery. On the other side, you have the forces around Team Evil, where sport has become control, domination, money, and artificial advantage. The film is not subtle about this contrast, and it does not need to be. Its moral world is painted in bold colors because it is working in the language of fable. What matters is not whether the villains are psychologically complex. What matters is what they represent. They are victory without spirit, strength without joy, professionalism without humanity. They are what happens when competition becomes detached from play, when winning becomes so important that the soul of the game is treated as weakness. And against that, the Shaolin team begins to stand for something beautifully unreasonable. They stand for the idea that skill should liberate the body, not imprison it. They stand for the idea that old wisdom can still move inside a modern world. They stand for friendship recovered after years of distance. They stand for people who are laughed at finally becoming impossible to ignore. By the time the story approaches its largest conflict, the film has transformed without pretending to transform. It still looks like a comedy, it still moves with cartoon energy, it still delights in absurd bodies and impossible impact. But emotionally, we are no longer simply watching a goofy team try to win a tournament. We are watching broken people step onto a field, carrying the question that has followed them their whole lives. Can the part of me that the world is missed still become my power? And here is where the film shifts completely. The making of Shaolin Soccer feels almost like the film's own story reflected behind the camera, an impossible idea, treated seriously enough to become real. Stephen Chow did not simply step into this film as a performer. He directed it, co-wrote it with Sung Kang-chong, and placed himself at the center as Sync, which matters because the whole movie depends on one unified comic imagination. Its production companies included Star Overseas and Universe Entertainment, and the film is commonly listed with an estimated budget around $10 million. A scale that makes sense when you look at how much it asks from choreography, effects, performance, and tonal control. But here is the first fact that reshapes the way I see it. According to reported interviews, Zhao had been carrying the idea of combining kung fu with football for years, but he needed visual effects technology to reach a point where the impossible motion could actually appear on screen. The influence often connected to that ambition is Captain Tsubasa, the Japanese football manga and anime, whose exaggerated athletic imagination had been widely loved in Hong Kong. And when you know that, the film's energy becomes clearer. Those football shots are not designed to look like normal sports coverage. They are designed like childhood memory, like the way a child imagines a perfect kick before learning the limits of the body. The ball does not simply move through space. It becomes desire with speed. It becomes fantasy made visible. The film is not trying to hide its exaggeration. It is trying to honor the emotional truth of exaggeration. The second fact is just as revealing. According to the same production history, Chow wanted this film to reach beyond the local market, and that international ambition sits inside the movie structure. That does not mean the film becomes less Hong Kong. Actually, it means the opposite. Chow seems to understand that the most universal thing he can offer is not a flattened version of his style, but the full force of it. So the film keeps its Cantonese comic rhythm, its more late absurdity, its martial arts tradition, its street level texture, and its enormous slapstick faces. It trusts that emotion will translate even when every joke does not. And in a way, that trust is the movie's secret production philosophy. The third fact is about casting, and it might be my favorite. Apart from veteran performers, Chow reportedly cast several people from around his own creative circle who did not have major acting experience before the film. Lam Chiu Chung, who plays Lightweight Fest, had worked as a screenwriter for Chiu, while Danny Chan Kwok Kwan, who plays Empty Hand, had been hired as a dance choreographer for the film's musical-style street sequence. Think about how beautifully that fits the film. A movie about hidden talent was made in part by recognizing hidden talent. People who might not have arrived through the cleanest traditional path into acting were placed into roles where their unusual physical presence, rhythm, and comic timing could become essential. Lightweight West does not work because he seems like a polished movie star. He works because the film needs someone whose body can be funny, surprising, vulnerable, and miraculous all at once. Empty Hand works because Danny Chan carries physical style before he even speaks. His Bruce Lee like silhouette is not just a joke, it is visual shorthand for cinema memory. The fourth fact belongs to the action language. The film's action direction is associated with Chin Sotum, a name deeply connected to Hong Kong fantasy movements, Wirework, and the floating impossible body. Credits and awards records also connect the film's action choreography to Chin, and that helps explain why the football sequences feel less like sports scenes and more like wuxia battles disguised as matches. That changes the way we watch the field. The pitch is not only a pitch, it is an arena. The players are not only players, the martial body is translated into sport. A header becomes a technique, a save becomes a combat stance, a run becomes a flying movement. The choreography does not ask football to become realistic, it asks football to become legible as kung fu, and that is difficult to do because sport has its own grammar. Martial arts cinema has its own grammar, comedy has its own grammar. If you push too hard toward sport, the kung fu becomes decoration. If you push toward martial arts, football disappears. If you push toward comedy, the matches lose tension. What the film achieves is a constant negotiation between all three. The fifth part is about the visual effects, and this is where the film becomes especially important for its moment. The effects work, credited in awards records to Central Digital Pictures, won major recognition. including Best Visual Effects at the Golden Horse Awards and Best Visual Effect at the Hong Kong Film Awards. Wired's early US coverage also described the film as a fusion of classic kung fu choreography, wire fu stunt work, and computer graphics, which captures exactly why the film felt so strange and new to many viewers outside Hong Kong, and knowing that makes the aging of the effects feel different. Yes, some images now carry the visible texture of early 2000s CGI, but that visibility does not ruin the film. In some moments, it almost protects the film's personality. The effects do not need to be invisible because the movie itself is not trying to be invisible. It is openly artificial, openly cartoonish, openly thrilled by the chance to draw movement across live action space. The production challenge then was not simply technical, it was tonal. Everyone involved had to agree on the same impossible reality. The actors had to perform humiliation and heroism inside the same scene. The action team had to make physical comedy feel like combat. The effects artists had to make football behave like myth. The editor had to let jokes breathe while still building sports momentum. The music by Loa Low and Raymond Wong had to support sincerity without making the comedy feel fake. That is why the film's construction is more delicate than it first appears. A lesser version of Shaolin Soccer might have been only a joke trailer stretched into a feature, but Chow builds it as a real emotional machine. Every production choice serves the central belief that ridiculous people can become magnificent if the camera loves them enough, and maybe that is the most important making of truth here. The film was not made by hiding its absurdity, it was made by trusting it completely. What Shailin Sakar achieves is not refinement. That may sound like criticism at first, but I mean it almost as praise. This is not a film that succeeds because every edge is smooth, every joke is elegant, every image is controlled into perfect balance. It succeeds because it understands the emotional power of excess. It knows that some feelings cannot be whispered, certain dreams are too better to return quietly. Certain characters have been made so small by life that when they finally rise, the film has to make the whole world shake around them. And that is what Stephen Chow does. He builds a movie where performance, writing, movement, sound, and visual exaggeration all serve one central emotional idea: the forgotten person becoming visible again. It started with Joe himself as Singh because the film depends entirely on whether you believe in his foolishness, not believe his claims literally, exactly, but believe the sincerity behind them. Singh could easily have become unbearable. A man constantly insisting that Shaolin Kung Fu belongs everywhere, constantly pushing his dream into spaces where nobody asked for it, constantly treating the ordinary world as if it is only one demonstration away from transformation. In another performance that could feel exhausting, but Cho gives Singh a strange innocence. He is comic, yes, sometimes absurdly so, but he is not empty. His eyes often carry the seriousness of someone who has no backup identity. Shaolin is not just something he knows, it is the way he understands himself. So when people laugh at it, they are not just rejecting an idea, they are rejecting the foundation of his dignity. That is why one of the most revealing parts of his performance is not the biggest kick or the loudest comic moment. It is the way Singh keeps returning after embarrassment. The way his posture may bend, his face may register confusion or hurt, but the central belief does not vanish. Zhao plays him as someone who has been humiliated so often that humiliation no longer has the final word. It can wound him, it can slow him, but it cannot define him. That is a very particular kind of strength. In Man-Tat, as Golden Leg Fung gives the film its emotional weight, Fung is not as explosive as Singh. He is not the source of the same kind of comic chaos. Instead, he carries disappointment like an old injury that never healed correctly. His body tells the story before the film explains it. The damaged walk, the tired face, the way pride and shame seem to argue inside him. The scene that proves the performance is not one of victory. It is any moment where Fum watches possibility return and does not quite know what to do with it. You can feel the conflict in him. He wants to believe. He wants to use the team as a road back to status. He wants revenge. He wants redemption. He wants to pretend those are the same thing, but deep down the Finn knows they are not. That complexity gives the story a stronger spine. Without Fung, Shaolin soccer might be only a wild fantasy about gifted outsiders. With him, it becomes a story about what failure does to the soul when nobody helps you put it down. And then there is Zhao Hui as Moi, whose performance is quieter, almost from another emotional weather system. In a film full of broad faces and gigantic movements, she brings softness. Her body language is closed, careful, shy, as if she has learned to take up less space than she deserves. But when she walks, when her hands move with dough, when the old discipline inside her slips into daily labor, something beautiful happens. The film shows that mastery does not always look like domination. Sometimes it looks like care. Mui's presence widens the film's understanding of power. The men's Shaolin abilities often explode outward. Her ability folds inward. It is patient, circular, tactile, domestic, hidden inside repetition. And because of that, she becomes essential to the film's model imagination. Shaolin Soccer is not only saying that greatness can survive humiliation, it is saying greatness can hide inside the places society does not bother to look. The writing, for all its cartoon logic, is sharper than it first appears because every major character is built around a lost relationship with ability. Singh has ability without recognition. Fong has memory without peace. The brothers have training without purpose. Moai has grace without confidence. Even the opposing force has power without spirit. That is simple writing, but simple does not mean shallow. In fact, that clarity is what allows the film to move so freely. Because the emotional purpose of each character is immediately readable, the movie can become absurd without losing its center. You may not always believe the physical reality, but you understand the emotional map. You know what each person needs from the journey. The screenplay also understands escalation. It begins with private humiliation and moves toward public revelation. That progression is elegant beneath the chaos. At first, the characters seem useless in ordinary life. Then they become useful in football. Then they become astonishing. Then they become necessary. By the end, what the world mocked becomes the only thing powerful enough to confront what the world fears. That is satisfying because it is not just about winning, it is about reversal. It is about the emotional pleasure of watching shame become strength. Visually, the film achieved something fascinating by refusing naturalism. Stephen Chow frames movement as emotional exaggeration. A kick does not need to obey the laws of sport because it is not only a kick. It is years of belief released through the body. A save is not only athletic reaction. It is discipline returning in the instant before collapse. A run, a leap, a strike, a fall, everything becomes expressive. The camera often treats bodies as comic instruments but also as vessels of myth. A character can look ridiculous 1 second and legendary the next. That transition is the essence of the film's visual language. It does not separate comedy and awe, it lets them occupy the same frame. And this is where the direction becomes more controlled than it appears. The film knows when to make space for impact. It knows when to hold long enough for a joke to land. It knows when to cut rapidly so movement feels overwhelming. It knows when to make a football shot feel like a martial arts attack and when to make a martial arts movement feel like a punchline. The result is a kind of live action comic book rhythm, but with a Hong Kong action soul. Space matters too. The early environments feel cramped, ordinary, and socially low. Streets, shops, workplaces, alleys, places where people survive, not where they become myths. Then the football field opens everything. Suddenly there is distance, speed, air, public attention. The characters who are trapped in narrow spaces now have room to become larger. That visual expansion mirrors the emotional expansion. The film begins close to the ground, it ends almost in legend. The score and sound play a huge role in making that work. The music knows the film is funny, but it does not treat the characters' dreams as a joke. That is crucial. When the film needs grandeur, the score gives it grandeur. When it needs ridiculous impact, the sound design exaggerates every strike, spin, collision, and impossible burst of force. The ball does not sound like a ball, it sounds like destiny with leather around it. And that is exactly right for this world. Silence is rarer here than in many films we might discuss on the Cineflux, but when quieter spaces appear, they matter because they give the chaos something to rise from. We scenes, Fung's regret, Singh's moments of wounded confusion. These pauses remind us that noise is not the opposite of feeling. Sometimes noise is what feeling becomes when it has been trapped too long. What this film achieves most clearly, though, is tonal courage. It is very difficult to be this silly and this sincere at the same time. Many films choose one side because blending them is risky. If the sincerity becomes too strong, the comedy can feel childish. If the comedy becomes too dominant, the sincerity can feel fake. Shaolin soccer keeps risking that imbalance, and the risk becomes part of its charm. It is willing to look foolish in order to reach joy. That may be the secret sentence of the whole movie, because the characters are also asked to do that. They must risk looking foolish before they can become free. Singh risks it from the beginning. Fung must relearn it. The brothers must pass through embarrassment on the way back to mastery. Moe must step beyond the safety of invisibility. Everyone has to cross the same emotional bridge, the fear of being seen before you are ready. And maybe that is why the film still connects. Under all the digital fire, slapstick violence, football fantasy, and martial arts exaggeration, Shaolin soccer achieves something deeply human. It understands that people do not only want success, they want their buried selves returned to them. They want someone to say, I remember what you were, I can still see it, it is not gone. For a comedy this wild, that is a surprisingly tender achievement. The film makes the impossible feel silly first, then joyful, then necessary. And by the time it has fully gathered its power, you realize the absurdity was never there to hide the emotion. It was there to set it free. Silence in Shodan soccer is strange, because the film is almost never truly quiet. It is full of shouting, impact, music, exaggerated reactions, and the wild sonic language of a world where a football can feel like thunder. But that is exactly why its quieter moments matter. They do not arrive as long meditative pauses, they arrive like small pockets of emotional truth hidden between bursts of chaos. And the film needs those pockets, because if everything were only noise, the characters would become cartoons without souls. The silence, or something close to silence, reminds us that the comedy is sitting on top of it. It lets us glimpse the loneliness beneath the slapstick, the shame beneath the joke, the tenderness beneath the absurdity. Think about Moy working with Doe. Those moments are not loud, in the same way the football scenes are loud. Her gift is not introduced through destruction or spectacle. It appears through rhythm, touch, repetition, and care. Her hands move with a discipline that no one around her fully honors. The camera does not need her to explain herself. The movement explains her. Her kung fu is not announced as greatness. It is simply there, quietly folded into labor. That is one of the most beautiful things the film understands. Some people carry mastery in ways the world refuses to name. They do not look heroic. They do not stand in stadiums. They do not receive applause. They just keep working day after day, turning survival into craft. Moe's silence is not emptiness, it is history, it is insecurity, it is patience, it is the private life of someone who has learned not to expect a recognition. The film communicates this without needing direct confession, it lets her body speak. And in a movie where so many bodies are used for explosion, her body becomes a different kind of language, smaller, softer, more inward. When she moves, the film briefly stops chasing impact and begins noticing grace. Fang's silence carries a different weight. His quiet moments are not gentle, they are bitter. They feel like a man standing beside the ruins of who he used to be. He does not always need to explain his regret, because regret has already shaped his face, his walk, his posture. You can feel that he has replayed the past too many times. You can feel the humiliation still living in him, not as memory, but as atmosphere. That is what silence does for Fang. It turns backstory into presence. A weaker film might have made him explain every feeling too directly, but Shaolin Soccer often lets his disappointment sit there, visible and uncomfortable. He watches Sing and something inside him seems to recognize both opportunity and pain. He watches the team begin to awaken and his face becomes a battlefield between hope and old resentment. That is cinematic language, not because it is subtle in the traditional art house sense, but because it trusts the image. It trusts the gap between what a character says and what he cannot yet admit. From wants victory, but silence tells us victory is not enough. He wants revenge, but silence tells us revenge will not heal him. He wants to return to the game, but silence tells us the real game is against the part of himself that stopped believing. Singh too has quiet inside him, even when he seems incapable of quiet behavior. His silence usually comes after embarrassment, after rejection, after the world pushes back against his dream. In those brief moments, the film allows us to see how vulnerable his belief really is. He may act foolish, but he is not invincible. His dream can be wounded. His face can fall. His certainty can flicker. And that flicker is important because it makes his faith human. If Singh were only confident, he would be a gag. If he were only ridiculous, he would be a cartoon. But when the film pauses long enough for her to cross his face, suddenly his belief feels brave. Not because he never doubts, but because he keeps going after doubt has touched him. The film also uses omission as a kind of silence. It does not show us every detail of the brothers' decline. It does not give each of them a heavy dramatic monologue about how life defeated them. It trusts us to understand. We see where they are now, and we feel the distance from who they once were. That missing space becomes powerful because it allows their ordinary lives to carry implication. Years have passed, dreams have narrowed, bodies have changed, pride has been hidden away. The film does not need to over explain that loss. It lets absence do the work, and this is where Shaolin soccer becomes more delicate than its reputation might suggest. Its loudest sequences may be the easiest to remember, but its emotional glue is often found in what it chooses not to verbalize: the longing between Sing and Moy, the shame inside Fung, the buried brotherhood among the former Shaolin students, the way each person hesitates before stepping back into possibility. Those pauses are small, but they matter. Because transformation is not only the moment when the ball flies through the air, it is also the moment before the kick, the breath, the doubt, the almost invisible choice to try again. In that sense, the film's silence is not quietness, it is the space where belief gathers strength before becoming impossible. For all its joy, Shaolin Soccer is not a perfect film. And honestly, perfection would almost feel wrong for something this unruly. This is a movie built from wild swings, big comic choices, sudden tonal turns, and emotional exaggeration. Some of its roughness gives it personality, some of its messiness makes it feel alive, but not every rough edge becomes charm. A few of them do leave marks. The first place the film falls short is in its uneven treatment of character depth. The main emotional lines are clear. Sing wants Shaolin to matter again. Fung wants to recover from the humiliation that broke him. Moy wants to be seen beyond the quiet shape life has forced her into. The brothers want to reconnect with buried greatness. Those ideas are strong. But some of the supporting brothers remain more like comic sketches than fully felt people. This is not always a problem because the film works in broad strokes. It is closer to a live action cartoon fable than a detailed ensemble drama. Still, there are moments where you can feel the movie rushing past emotional possibilities that could have made the teen's recovery even richer. Each brother represents a different form of lost potential, but not everyone gets the same inner life. We understand the idea of their comeback more than we always feel the personal cost behind it. That matters because the team is the heart of the film's second half. When they become powerful together, it is exciting, it is funny, it is visually memorable. But emotionally, it might have landed even harder if the film had allowed a little more space for individual wounds. Not long speeches, not heavy exposition, just a few more intimate moments where we could feel what each man had privately surrendered before Singh brought them back. The second weakness is tonal imbalance. Now, tonal imbalance is also part of the film's identity. Shaolin Soccer is supposed to jump between absurdity and sincerity. That is its rhythm. but occasionally the comedy becomes so broad that it risks flattening the emotional reality beneath it. Some jokes lean so heavily on appearance, awkwardness, or humiliation that they can feel harsher now than they may have felt in their original moment. This is especially true around Bui. Her character carries one of the film's gentlest ideas, hidden grace inside someone the world overlooks. But some of the humor surrounding her appearance and social discomfort can feel blunt. The film does ultimately see her beauty and value, but the route it takes is not always as tender as the idea deserves. There is a difference between showing how cruel the world can be and asking the viewer to participate too much in that cruelty. At times, the film moves close to that line, and this is where modern viewing creates tension. You can understand the comic tradition the film comes from. You can recognize the broadness of its style. You can still feel affection for the character and the story. But you can also admit that a few moments do not land with the same warmth today. That does not destroy the film. It simply gives the viewing experience texture. It reminds us that even joyful cinema can carry the limitations of its time. The third issue is the villainy. Team Evil works perfectly as a symbolic force. They are not meant to be subtle. They represent corrupted sport, artificial strength, victory without spirit, and the machinery of power crushing sincerity. In a fable, that kind of bold opposition can be very effective, but as drama, they remain thin. They are threatening because the film tells us they are dangerous and shows us their force, but they do not have the comic emotional richness that makes their heroes interesting. This creates a slight imbalance near the end. The final conflict is visually fun and thematically clear, but the opposition does not deepen the film as much as it could. Imagine if the villains had reflected the heroes more sharply. Imagine if they were not only strong through corruption but also former dreamers who chose power over belief. That kind of mirror might have made the final match more emotionally complicated. Instead, the film chooses clarity over depth. Again, that choice is understandable. Shaolin soccer is not trying to become a morally complex sports tragedy. It wants the field to become a mythic arena where innocence, teamwork, and discipline face greed, cruelty, and artificial dominance. On that level, the villains serve their purpose. But they serve function more than feeling. The fourth flaw is pacing. The film moves with incredible energy, but there are stretches where the rhythm becomes uneven. Some comic scenes stay just a little longer than their emotional usefulness. Some transitions happen with such sudden force that character development feels compressed. The middle section, especially around team assembly and early matches, sometimes feels like a chain of brilliant comic concepts rather than a perfectly shaped emotional progression. But here is the thing about this flaw. It is also tied with film's pleasure. The looseness gives the movie room to surprise you. It allows weirdness to breathe. It lets Stephen Chow follow comic instinct instead of reducing everything to plot efficiency. So the pacing problem is not a fatal wound. It is more like a side effect of the film's freedom. You feel the mess because the film is alive enough to create it. The fifth weakness is visual aging. Some of the CGI has aged clearly. There are moments where the digital bold, the impact effects, and the exaggerated physics now look tied to that era. For some viewers, that might create distance. If you come expecting modern seamlessness, the film may look rough. But I hesitate to call this a true flaw without qualification. Because the effects were never aiming for invisible realism, never aiming for comic myth. Their artificiality is part of the film's language. Still, there are moments where the texture of the technology briefly pulls attention away from the emotion. Not enough to break the film, but enough to notice. So where does Shaolin Soccer fall? It falls where its boldness outruns its delicacy. It falls where its supporting characters could have carried more personal weight. It falls where some jokes age less gracefully than the joy around them. It falls where the villains remain symbols instead of souls. But these are not wounds that drain the film of life. They are cracks in something wonderfully energetic. And sometimes, with a film like this, the cracks are visible because the movie is reaching so far beyond safe control. It wants comedy, action, sports, romance, fantasy, and redemption all at once. Of course, not every piece lands perfectly. The real question is whether the feeling survives, and it does, Because even when Shaolin soccer stumbles, it stumbles forward with its heart exposed. What Shaolin soccer is really saying is simple enough to feel like a joke until you realize how much life is hiding inside it. It is saying that the thing people laugh at in you may be the thing that saves you. That is the emotional core, not football, not kung fu, not even victory. The deeper subject is the shame people attach to gifts that do not fit neatly into ordinary life. Singh believes in Shaolin with his whole body, but the world treats that belief like a public inconvenience. Moi carries grace in her hands, but the world does not look closely enough to honor it. Fung once had greatness, but one ruined moment turned his gift into a source of lifelong humiliation. The brothers were trained for something extraordinary, but daily survival swallowed their identities until their abilities became almost embarrassing memories. The film keeps returning to one question: what happens to people when the most meaningful part of them is treated as useless? That is why Shaolin Kung Fu in this film is more than a martial art. It becomes a symbol for buried purpose. It represents discipline, memory, self respect, tradition, and the body's knowledge of who it used to be. Singh's dream is not simply to make Kung Fu popular. His dream is to prove that the past still has value inside the present. That old wisdom does not have to sit behind glass, it can walk into the street. It can help people park cars, make food, play football, survive embarrassment, and imagine themselves differently. Think about it this way: most people in the film are not lacking talent. They are lacking a world that knows what to do with their talent. That is a much sadder thing. A person can survive not being gifted, but having a gift and nowhere to place it creates a special kind of loneliness. You begin to wonder whether the gift was ever real. You begin to hide it. You begin to shrink yourself until life stops asking questions you are tired of answering. Shaolin Soccer turns that hidden loneliness into comedy, but the pain remains underneath. The football field becomes powerful because it gives all these lost abilities a shared purpose. It is not just a place to compete, it is a place where the character's strange gifts finally make sense. A kick, a leap, a defensive stance, a moment of speed. Suddenly, these things are not ridiculous, they're needed. And when a gift becomes needed, the person carrying it begins to heal. That is what this film understands. Recognition is not only applause, recognition is usefulness. It is the moment when someone looks at what you carry and says, "This belongs here. You belong here." That is why the team matters so much. Singh cannot complete the meaning of the film alone. If he were only proving himself, the story would become ego. But by gathering the brothers, he transforms his private belief into collective restoration. The film is telling us that healing often happens through being seen by people who remember us correctly. These men have forgotten each other in the practical sense, but on some deeper level, they still carry a shared past. When they reunite, they are not only forming a sports team, they are returning to a version of themselves that life interrupted. And this is where the film becomes unexpectedly moving. It understands that adulthood often feels like losing contact with the person you once promised yourself you would become. Not dramatically, not all at once. Slowly, through work, disappointment, compromise, humiliation, financial pressure, fatigue, and the tiny daily decisions that teach you to be smaller because being large costs too much. The Shaolin brothers are funny because their decline is exaggerated, but the feeling is not exaggerated at all. Who has not felt some part of themselves go unused for too long? Who has not looked back at an earlier dream and wondered whether it belonged to a braver run of them? Who has not laughed at their own ambition before anyone else could do it first? That is why the comedy lands deeper than expected. It is not laughing at failure from above, it is laughing from inside failure, trying to find a door. Mui's story adds another layer to this meaning because her invisibility is quieter. She is not trying to announce a grand philosophy, she is not trying to start a movement. She simply exists with a kind of hidden grace that has not been welcomed into the world. Her skill is domestic, repetitive, humble, and therefore easy to overlook. The film uses her to say that greatness does not always appear in forms society rewards. Sometimes it is in care, sometimes in patience, sometimes in a pair of hands doing the same task every day until ordinary work becomes art. That is a beautiful idea and also a painful one, because the film knows that being unseen changes how a person sees themselves. Moe does not simply lack confidence because of nothing. Her shyness feels like something learned, a response to how people have treated her, how little space she has been given, how often the world has trained her to expect dismissal. Her transformation is not only about appearance or romance. At its best, it is about the frightening experience of allowing yourself to be visible after years of hiding. Fung's meaning is darker. Through him, the film explores what happens when shame becomes permanent. His life has been defined by one collapse, one betrayal, one public fall from grace. And the tragedy is not only that he lost his career, it is that he accepted the identity built around that loss. He became the story other people told about him. He allowed the worst chapter to become the title of the whole book. That is why his journey is not simply about coaching a team to victory. It is about separating memory from destiny. The past happened. The wound is real. The humiliation shaped him. But the film asks whether a person can still move after being reduced to their lowest moment. And because this is Shaolin soccer, the answer does not come through a quiet therapy scene or a solemn confession. It comes through a ridiculous team of former monks learning to play football with impossible power. That is the film's magic. It finds sincere emotional answers in absurd places. The recurring symbol of the ball is important because it is both ordinary and mythic. A football is one of the simplest objects in the world, round, familiar, shared by millions. But in this film, it becomes charged with everything the characters cannot say. When it moves, it carries belief. When it is kicked, it carries rage, hope, discipline, revenge, joy, and release. It becomes a visible form of inner force. The field too becomes symbolic. It is open space, public space, a place where private shame must become public action. You cannot hide on the field. You cannot keep your gift folded away. The match demands exposure. That is why the sport works so well for this story. It forces the characters to become visible together, and Evil Blunt, as the name may be, represents the opposite of this visibility. They stand for power without inner truth. They are strength separated from humanity. Their force is artificial, controlled, cold, and corrupt. They want victory without joy, domination without play, success without soul. Against them, the Shaolin team looks messy, poor, strange, and imperfect, but their power comes from something lived. Their bodies carry history. Their teamwork carries rediscovery. So the film's rare world resonance is not difficult to feel. We live in a world that often asks people to prove usefulness in narrow ways. Can your talent make money? Can your dream become practical? Can your passion be branded, measured, explained, optimized? And if it cannot, it is easy for the world to treat it like childishness. Shaolin soccer pushes back against that. It says that not every meaningful thing begins as a career plan. Some gifts begin as faith. Some dreams look foolish because the right field has not appeared yet. Here is what I keep returning to. The film does not say belief automatically makes life easy. It does not say every dream will be understood immediately. It does not even say that sincerity protects you from mockery. Fing is mocked constantly. Moe is overlooked. Fung is wounded. The brothers are reduced. But the film insists that ridicule is not proof that a dream is false. Sometimes ridicule is only the world failing to imagine what you can become. And this is why Shaolin Soccer feels larger than its own silliness. It is a film about rejected forms of beauty finding a stage. It is about old skills entering new games. It is about the body remembering dignity before the mind fully believes in it again. It is about the coup as a cure for private defeat. Most of all, it is about refusing to let shame be the final editor of your life. That is what this film understands. That people do not need to become someone else in order to be extraordinary. Sometimes they need to return to the part of themselves they were taught to hide. And when that return happens here, it does not happen quietly. It happens with the football flying through the air like a prayer that finally found momentum. Stephen Chow's signature is not simply that he makes absurd comedy. That is the easy description and it misses the heart of what he does. Plenty of filmmakers can make scenes loud. Plenty can build a ridiculous premise. Plenty can ask performers to exaggerate their faces, bodies, timing, and reactions until ordinary behavior turns into cartoon rhythm. But Chow's best work understands something deeper. Absurdity becomes unforgettable when it grows out of humiliation. His cinema often begins with people at the bottom, not noble outsiders in a polished romantic sense, not clean underdogs designed only to inspire. His characters are frequently embarrassing, poor, socially awkward, ignored, strange, and wounded in ways that make them look funny before they look heroic. The world laughs at them first. The audience may laugh too, but then, little by little, Chow changes the temperature of that laughter. He lets you realize that the joke has a soul inside it. That is his signature. He builds comedy from people who have been made small, then reveals that smallness was never the truth of them. In Shaolin soccer, this instinct is everywhere. Singh is not introduced as a glamorous martial hero. He is a man trying to explain a sacred belief in a world that has no patience for him. His dream sounds impractical. His behavior feels inconvenient. His passion makes people uncomfortable. But Chow does not frame that as emptiness. He frames it as misplaced devotion. Singh is ridiculous because his belief is too large for the world he is standing in, and that is classic Stephen Chow. He loves the gap between inner greatness and outer disgrace. His characters often carry some hidden nobility, but life has covered it with dirt, jokes, bad luck, hunger, or public shame. The comedy comes from the covering. The emotion comes from the reveal. What makes Shaolin soccer especially important in his body of work is how clearly it turns that pattern into a visual system. In many comedies, humiliation is only a setup. Here, humiliation becomes the raw material of transformation. A character is mocked, then the same body that looked foolish becomes miraculous. A person appears useless, then the exact quality that made them look strange becomes their gift. A group of failures becomes a team because failure has trained them to understand each other. Chow sees the world as a place where dignity is unevenly distributed. Some people are given respect before they earn it, others have to perform miracles just to be seen as human. His films often side with the second group. They do not always do it gently. Sometimes the jokes are harsh, sometimes the style is blunt, but the emotional allegiance is clear. He is drawn to people who are laughed at by power, by society, by beauty standards, by money, by the cold logic of success, and then he lets those people bend reality. That is another part of his signature. The world of the film eventually begins to obey the emotional truth of the character. If someone's buried power is enormous, the image becomes enormous. If a dream is impossible, the film does not shrink the dream into realism. It expands reality until the dream can fit. That is why Shaolin soccer feels so connected to Kung Fu Husserl, even though the stories are different. Both films are fascinated by martial arts as hidden inheritance. Both place extraordinary power inside ordinary or ridiculous bodies. Both move between slapstick cruelty and sudden beauty. Both understand that Kung Fu can function not only as action but as memory, a cultural and spiritual force waiting beneath the surface of daily life. But Shaolin soccer is also distinct because it attaches Chow's comic worldview to a sport. Football gives his signature a collective shape. In many hero stories, one person discovers their power. Here, the discovery has to become shared. Singh's belief means nothing unless it awakens other people. That gives the film a warmth that feels different from a solo transformation. It is not just one clown becoming a legend. It is a whole group of discarded people becoming visible together. Chow's visual obsessions are also clear here. Bodies in impossible motion, impact pushed beyond realism, faces held long enough for awkwardness to become funny, ordinary locations suddenly charged with myth, and a constant tension between ugliness and grace. He is not afraid of making images that look strange. In fact, strangeness is part of his honesty. His films do not usually seek polished beauty first. They seek comic energy, then allow beauty to appear unexpectedly. That is why Moe's making scenes feel so revealing. They show another side of Chow's artistic instinct. He can be loud, but he is also drawn to hidden elegance. He recognizes that Kung Fu is not only spectacular combat, It can be rhythm, touch, craft, patience, and repetition. In those moments, he shows that his comedy is not opposed to grace. It is often the path toward grace. Watching Shaolin soccer teaches you that Stephen Chow sees the world as cruel but not hopeless. He knows people can be mocked. He knows dreams can be treated like jokes. He knows talent can be wasted, beauty can be hidden, and failure can become a cage. But he also believes in reversal. He believes the fool may be carrying wisdom. The loser may be waiting for the right field. The old discipline may still have a future. The ridiculous body may become cinematic poetry. This film is not a departure from his signature. It is one of the clearest expressions of it. Stephen Chow takes humiliation, gives it speed, gives it rhythm, gives it a football, and turns it into flight. The second time you watch Shaolin Soccer, the surprise changes shape. The first viewing is mostly impact. You are meeting the film's rules. You are learning how far it is willing to bend reality. You are discovering that a football can move like a meteor, that a joke can suddenly become emotional, that a group of ridiculous men can somehow make you feel the old pleasure of believing in underdogs again. But on rewatch, the chaos becomes more organized. You begin to notice how early the film tells you what it is really about. It is not hiding its meaning, it is hiding its tenderness behind noise. From the beginning, every major character is already carrying the wound that they will have to transform. Sing's public foolishness is already a form of courage. Fung's bitterness is already grief wearing an old coat. Moe's quietness is already a kind of buried strength. The brothers' comic decline is already a map of lost identity. What changes on rewatch is that you stop asking whether the film will become sincere. You realize it was sincere all along. The early jokes feel different once you know where the characters are going. The scenes where Singh is mocked no longer play only as comic embarrassment. They become literal tests of his spiritual endurance. Every time someone dismisses him, you are watching the world try and fail to shrink his belief. That makes him more moving the second time because his fate no longer feels random. It feels practiced. It feels like something he has had to protect for years. Fung becomes more tragic too. On a first viewing, his role may seem simple. The fallen coach, the man with a damaged past, the one who sees Singh's potential and turns it toward football. But when you return to the film, his early scenes carry more emotional weight. You can feel how much humiliation has shaped his decisions. You can see that he is not only looking for victory, he is looking for proof that his life did not end at the moment everyone else decided it did. That is a painful thing to carry. And because you know how the story resolves, the rewatch makes his pride feel more fragile. He is not simply using the team, he is slowly being used by hope, and he does not know how to admit it. Moe's details also become clearer the second time. Her scenes are easy to remember because they are visually distinct, softer than the film around them. But on rewatch, you notice how carefully the film connects her to its larger idea of hidden mastery. Her hands, her posture, her hesitation, her way of moving through the world as if apologizing for taking up space. These details tell the story before the plot does. The first time, you may watch her as a romantic figure in Sting's orbit. The second time, you see her as one of the purest expressions of the film's soul. She is not there only to support his journey. She reflects it. Both of them carry something people do not know how to value. Both have gifts trapped in ordinary life. Both are made awkward by a world that sees surfaces too quickly. That parallel becomes more touching once you recognize it. The brothers also gain a different rhythm on rewatch. Their introductions may feel like broad comic sketches at first, but later you begin to see them as variations on the same wound. Each one has become separated from the body that once knew discipline. Their return is funny, but it is also strangely sad. You are not just watching men regain powers, you are watching them remember themselves. That is why the training and early matches feel more rewarding the second time. You already know the spectacle is coming, so you become more attentive to the hesitation before the spectacle, the doubt before the kick, the embarrassment before the breakthrough. The small moment when a character's body seems to recall something the mind had given up on. Foreshadowing in Shaolin Soccer is not subtle in the traditional sense, but it is emotionally effective. Defin keeps showing you that ordinary gestures can contain extraordinary force. Sing's kick, Moi's toe work, the brothers' strange bodies, Fung's injured pride, all of it is preparing you to accept the final logic that what looked useless was never useless. It was only waiting for the right form. Does the film gain power on rewatch? Emotionally, yes. The jokes may not all become funnier. Some may even feel rougher with time. The effects may look more visibly tied to their era. The pacing may reveal its looseness more clearly. But the heart becomes easier to see. The second viewing softens the film because you begin to understand its noise as defense, its absurdity as longing, its wildness as a refusal to let shame win. The surprise becomes a fiction, and maybe that is the best kind of rewatch layer. Not one where every hidden detail unlocks a puzzle, but one where the film becomes more human because you already know its face. You stop waiting for it to prove itself. You meet it where it lives. And where it lives is in that impossible space between embarrassment and flight. Shaolin soccer feels wildly original, but it is also standing on the shoulders of several cinematic traditions. That is part of its charm. It does not invent itself from nothing. It inherits, exaggerates, jokes with, and transforms older languages of cinema until they become something that feels unmistakably Stephen Chow. You can feel martial arts cinema inside it. You can feel sports melodrama. You can feel silent era slapstick. You can feel comic book exaggeration. You can feel the old Hong Kong belief that action does not have to obey realism as long as it obeys rhythm. The first and most obvious inheritance is Kung Fu cinema. For decades, martial arts films had turned the trained body into a site of philosophy. A punch was not only a punch, a kick was not only a kick. Movement revealed discipline, morality, patience, spiritual focus, and identity. The body became biography. You could understand a character by how they fought, how they stood, how they waited, how they lost control, how they returned to balance. Shaolin Soccer takes that inheritance and removes it from the expected sacred frame. Instead of tempos, training horse, revenge quests, and solemn duels, Chow places Kung Fu inside the mess of modern life. The question becomes almost comic at first. What happens when ancient discipline survives in a world of street food, broken jobs, poor neighborhoods, and football tournaments? But the answer is surprisingly rich. The film says tradition does not become meaningless just because the setting changes. It can mutate, it can become funny and still remain powerful. That is the conversation the film joins. It is speaking to earlier martial arts cinema, but it is also teasing it with affection. The old heroic body is still here, but now it may be badly dressed, socially awkward, out of shape, underpaid, or completely misunderstood. The master may not look like a master anymore. The warrior may be hiding inside a cook, a worker, a failed athlete, or a fool. That idea connects the film to a long Hong Kong tradition where comedy and martial arts are not enemies. Jackie Chan's films had already shown how the body could be heroic and ridiculous at the same time. Injury, embarrassment, timing, and improvisation could all become part of action. But Shaolin Soccer pushes that comic body into a more supernatural, digital direction. It is less about practical stunt realism and more about emotional physics. The body does not only perform skill, it becomes a curtain of spiritual force. You can also feel the shadow of Bruce Lee, especially through the film's visual memory of iconic martial arts presence. But Chow's relationship to that legacy is not simple imitation, it is affectionate transformation. Bruce Lee represented control, intensity, precision, and a kind of revolutionary screen charisma. Shaolin Soccer takes that memory and lets it appear inside a comedy about forgotten people. It asks what happens when legendary imagery is fitted through ordinary bodies, comic failure, and playful exaggeration. The result is not disrespect. It is proof that cinema icons do not only survive through seriousness, they survive when later artists can play with them and still feel their electricity. Then there is the sports film tradition, the underdog team, the broken coach, the rejected players, the training, the early humiliation, the growing unity, the final match against a stronger, more corrupt opponent. Shaolin Soccer knows these shapes. very well. It does not pretend we have never seen them before. Instead, it uses their familiarity as a foundation. Because we already understand the emotional drama of the underdog story, the film is free to become completely absurd on top of it. That is smart storytelling. The sports structure gives us stability, the kung fu fantasy gives us surprise, the comedy gives us race. Without the familiar sports skeleton, the film's madness might float away. Without the madness, the sports story might feel too familiar. The power is in the collision. You can also sense the influence of animated sports fantasy, where athletic movement becomes larger than life, where a shot can feel like destiny, where the field becomes a battlefield of dreams rather than just a physical space. Shaolin soccer brings that animated imagination into live action. It lets the football behave the way emotion behaves in a child's mind: faster, stronger, brighter, more impossible than reality allows. And this matters because the film is not only borrowing from cinema before it, it is changing the purpose of those influences. Traditional martial arts cinema often asks how discipline defeats violence, corruption, or personal weakness. Sports cinema often asks how teamwork defeats stronger opposition. Slapstick asks how bodies survive humiliation. Shaolin soccer fuses all three and asks a different question: how can ridiculous people recover dignity through motion? That is its contribution. It takes the solemn inheritance of Kung Fu and makes it public, comic, democratic. It takes the sports combat narrative and turns it into a spiritual reawakening. It takes slapstick embarrassment and turns it into the first stage of heroism. It does not simply quote the cinema that came before, it retours it for a new emotional mission. And maybe that is why the film feels so freeing. It reminds us that cinema history is not a museum, it is a playground, a living field. Old forms can still run, old gestures can still score, old myths can still become new jokes, and new jokes can still carry old myths. Shaolin Soccer inherited a century of screen movement and kicked it into the sky. From this moment, we go into full spoilers. If you have not yet seen this film, stop here, go experience it first, and come back. Some things deserve to be felt before they are understood. What Shaolin Soccer reveals, once it moves into its full final shape, is that the tournament was never only a tournament, it was a public ritual of restoration. Every major turning point has been toward the same emotional release, the forgotten person becoming undeniable. Singh begins as a man treated like a fool because he believes too much. Fung begins as a fallen athlete whose life has been trapped inside one public disgrace. Moy begins as someone whose grace is hidden inside labor and insecurity. The brothers begin as scattered men who have lost contact with their old discipline, and the story keeps tightening around question: when the world has decided what you are, can you still become something else? The answer arrives through the matches. At first, the Shaolin team is not respected as athletes. They are treated as a joke, a strange collection of nobodies entering a world that has rules, status, and expectations. But the more they play, the more the football field becomes a place of revelation. Their skills begin to emerge not as tricks, but as fragments of identity returning. A body that looked slow remembers speed. A man who seemed weak remembers force. A ridiculous formation becomes a strategy. Their old Shaolin training, once useless in modern life, suddenly becomes the very thing that allows them to survive. That is the first great spoiler level shift of the film. The world starts to see what Singh has been seeing all along, and that matters because Singh's dream was never purely personal. He does not only want to win, he wants Shaolin to re enter the world. He wants people to understand that all discipline still has a living purpose. Through football, his impossible idea becomes visible. He does not need to argue anymore. The field argues for him. Fung's arc deepens as the team rises. At first, he appears to be using Singh and the brothers as a way back into football and maybe as a way to answer the man who once destroyed his future. But slowly, the team becomes more than revenge. It becomes a second chance at meaning. Fong cannot undo the past. He cannot return to the exact moment before betrayal. But he can choose what that past becomes inside him. He can let it remain poison, or he can turn it into guidance. The final movement against Team Evil forces that choice into the open. Team Evil is not subtle, and the film does not pretend otherwise. They are the corrupted mirror of the Shaolin team. Their strength is unnatural in the wrong way. Not a joyful impossibility of discipline and belief, but a cold impossibility of manipulation, enhancement, and control. They represent winning stripped of spirit. They show what power looks like when it has no humility, no play, no love for the game, no respect for the body as something human. So when the final match begins, the film becomes more than a sports climax. It becomes a moral collision between two kinds of power. One kind is rooted in memory, brotherhood, pain, recovery, and practice. The other is rooted in domination. Team Evil does not want to play beautifully. They want to crush. They do not want to test themselves against another team. They want to erase the other team's right to stand. And because this is the film's final battle, their violence has to feel overwhelming. The Shaolin players are battered, shaken, and pushed beyond the comic safety of earlier matches. This is where the film's silliness becomes surprisingly serious. The injuries and collapses are not presented for cruelty. They show us the cost of facing a system that does not care about fairness. The Shaolin team has built itself from belief, but belief alone does not prevent pain. That is important. The film may be fantastical, but it does not say sincerity makes you untouchable. It says sincerity gives you a reason to stand back up. And then comes the key emotional reversal. The team needs Moy. Moy's arrival is not just a plot solution. It is the completion of the film's hidden argument. From the beginning, her skill has existed in the margins. She has been associated with food, work, shyness, and overlooked grace. Her kung fu has not been treated with the same public spectacle as the men's abilities. But in the final match, when the team is broken and the goalkeeper role becomes impossible to fill in the usual way, Moi steps into the space where she was always meant to be seen. That moment matters because it brings the film's quietest form of mastery into its loudest arena. She's not there as decoration. She's not there only as emotional support for Singh. She enters the field as someone whose hidden discipline can change the outcome. The same grace that once shaped Do now meets the force of Team Evil's attack. What had been domestic becomes heroic. What had been private becomes public. What had been invisible becomes essential. That is one of the film's most meaningful transformations. Moe's shaved head and altered appearance also complicate the emotion of the ending. The film's handling of her beauty and self image is not perfect, and some of the comedy around her remains rough. But in the final match, the stronger idea still comes through. She is no longer asking the world for permission to exist. She places herself in the center of the field. She meets impossible force directly. She becomes part of the team not because someone finally makes her acceptable, but because her ability has always been real. The final football action is pure cinematic exaggeration, but emotionally it is very clear. Teen Evil attacks with terrifying force. The ball becomes almost destructive, an object carrying all the cold violence of corrupted victory. Moe answers not with brute strength alone, but with control, balance, and inner stillness. The film turns the goal into a spiritual gate. If Team Evil scores, the world of artificial domination wins. If Moe stands, the hidden and humble forms of power are finally honored. And she stands. Singh's final act becomes the release the whole film has been preparing. His kick is not only athletic triumph, it is the complete expression of his belief. Everything he has been mocked for, everything he has insisted on, everything he has tried to explain to people who would not listen, it all gathers into movement. His Shaolin discipline, his foolish hope, his bruised dignity, his love for the game, his connection to the team, his belief in why, his refusal to stay small, it all travels through the ball. The winning moment is joyful because it is absurd, but it is also joyful because it is earned, not through realism, through emotional logic. The film has trained us to understand that inner truth becomes outer force. So when Singh finally sends that impossible shot forward, it does not feel random. It feels like the only language big enough for what he carries. His dream has moved from street preaching to public proof. He does not have to tell the world Shaolin matters anymore. The world has watched it happen. The ending also resolves Fung's wound with more grace than it first appears. His redemption is not that he becomes young again, or that the past is erased, or that the humiliation never happened. His redemption is that the sport no longer belongs only to the day he was destroyed. It now belongs to the team he helped create. He has taken the place of his old injury and filled it with new meaning. Football for him stops being only a reminder of betrayal. It becomes a place where belief returns. That is healing in the language of this film. Not forgetting, reframing. The public aftermath, where Shaolin begins spreading into ordinary life, is one of the film's funniest and most revealing ideas. People begin using kung fu in everyday situations. The old discipline becomes part of modern movement. This is Singh's dream made real, but the film presents it with comic exaggeration because that is the only way it knows how to celebrate. It is not saying society has literally become perfect. It is saying the imagination has opened. The world that once laughed at Shaolin now imitates it. That finer social shift gives the ending a fairy tale quality. The overlooked tradition returns. The fools are vindicated. The broken team becomes legendary. The woman no one properly saw becomes essential. The fallen coach finds dignity. The dreamer is no longer alone inside his dream. There is no post-credit scene that changes the meaning in some franchise-building way. The real after-image is emotional. The film leaves us with a world slightly more elastic than before, a world where the impossible has entered daily life and made it funnier, freer, and more alive. And the foreshadowing becomes clear only after the ending. Moisto's work was always goalkeeping in disguise. Singh's public speeches were always the beginning of a movement. The brothers' commit bodies were always weapons waiting to remember themselves. Fung's resentment was always grief waiting for a second chance. Even the film's ridiculous early tone was preparing us for a climax where absurdity would become sincerity without needing to change clothes. That is the strange beauty of Shaolin soccer. It does not mature by becoming less silly. It matures by proving that silliness had meaning from the beginning. By the end, the football field has become a place where every hidden thing is revealed. Hidden talent, hidden pain, hidden love, hidden discipline, hidden beauty, hidden shame. Everything comes out through movement. Nobody gives a perfect speech explaining the whole soul of the film because they do not need to. The ball does it. The bodies do it. The final match does it. And personally, what I feel in the ending is not only happiness, I feel relief. Relief that the film allows these people to be ridiculous and worthy at the same time. Relief that it does not ask them to become polished before they are allowed to be heroic. Relief that Singh's dream, which looked so foolish in the beginning, is not corrected into something practical. It stays foolish. It simply becomes true. That is what makes the ending beautiful, not because it is believable in a literal sense, because emotionally it understands something real. Sometimes the world changes its mind about you only after you stop asking politely to be understood and finally show the full force of what you are. What Shaolin Soccer leaves behind in me is not one joke, one kick, or one impossible shot. It is the feeling of people becoming less embarrassed to exist. That is the part I carry. Because beneath the comedy, beneath the flying footballs and exaggerated bodies and wide visual effects, the film has such a tender relationship with shame. It understands how quietly shame can organize a life. It can decide how much space you take up. It can decide which dreams you mention out loud and which ones you bury. It can make talent feel childish. It can make belief feel socially dangerous. It can make a person laugh at themselves before the world gets the chance. And then this film comes along and says, maybe the thing you are ashamed of is not the thing that makes you weak. Maybe it is the doorway that stays with me. Singh stays with me because he is not cool in the usual cinematic way. He does not have that polished heroic distance. He is strange, poor, intense, irritating, funny, and often completely out of step with the world around him. But he has something many cooler characters do not have. He has a belief that survives ridicule. There is something quietly moving about that, Not because the film pretends belief is easy, it shows again and again that belief can make you look foolish. It can isolate you. It can make people dismiss you before they understand you. But it also shows that a person without belief becomes easier for the world to reduce. Singh's dream protects something inside him. It keeps one part of his soul from becoming practical in the worst way. Fung stays with me differently. He is a reminder that failure can become a prison when no one helps you separate the event from the identity. He lost something, and then he became known by the losing. That is such a painful human truth. Sometimes life does not only wound you, it renames you after the wound. And if you hear that name often enough, you begin to answer to it. His journey matters because he does not erase the past. He finds a new relationship with it. He takes a field that once represented humiliation and helps turn it into a place of restoration. That is not a clean miracle. It is something more honest. It is meaning rebuilt from ruins. Moe may be the character I think about most softly. Her presence lingers because she represents all the people whose beauty has been hidden inside ordinary work. People whose skill does not announce itself, people whose grace has become part of survival, people who do not know how powerful they are because the world has trained them to expect smallness. The image of her hands working with dough stays with me more than some of the giant football moments. Because in that image, the film quietly says that artistry is not always where society looks for it. Sometimes it is in kitchens, in repetitive labor, in humble gestures, in the private discipline of someone doing something well, even when no one claps. And that changes how I see the film. It makes Shaolin Soccer feel less like a movie about becoming extraordinary and more like a movie about finally recognizing the extraordinary that was already there. That is a more generous idea. The final match is thrilling, but what stays with me is the emotional permission around it. The film gives its characters permission to be ridiculous and worthy at the same time. It does not demand that they become elegant before they can matter. It does not ask them to hide their awkwardness, their brokenness, or their comic excess. It takes all of that with them onto the field. That feels strangely healing. Because so much of life teaches people to edit themselves into acceptable shapes, be less intense, be less strange, be less sincere, be less hopeful, make your dreams sound more realistic, make your passion sound more useful, make your personality easier to explain. Shaolin Soccer refuses that kind of editing. It says the full, awkward, excessive wound itself may be exactly where the power lives. Would I return to it? Yes, but not because it is flawless. I would return to it because it has a spirit that many smoother films do not have. It feels handmade in its emotional messiness. It feels open hearted. It feels like a film that does not mind looking foolish if foolishness is the cost of reaching joy. And I think the kind of person who will carry this film after the credits is someone who understands what it means to have been underestimated. Someone who has hidden a gift because it did not seem practical. Someone who has felt embarrassed by their own sincerity. Someone who has needed a team, a field, a moment, a little impossible momentum. That is what Shaolin Soccer leaves behind, not just laughter. A strange, bright reminder that sometimes dignity returns through the most ridiculous doorway imaginable. Shaolin Soccer is the kind of film that asks you to meet it on its own terms. If you come to it looking for clean realism, perfect emotional subtlety, or the kind of controlled sports drama where every beat is polished into seriousness, it may feel too strange, too broad, too chaotic, maybe even too childish in places. But if you come to it willing to understand its language, something warmer begins to appear. You start to see that its foolishness is not empty. Its exaggeration is not random. Its comedy is not just decoration around the sports story. It is the film's way of protecting sincerity. And that is what makes the experience linger. Shaolin Soccer may not be one of those films that moves with perfect elegance from beginning to end, but it has something many technically cleaner movies do not have. It has spirit, it has belief. It has that strange, generous energy of a film that wants every forgotten person to get one impossible chance to be seen. The people who will love this most deeply are the ones who can accept that cinema does not always have to whisper in order to be honest. Sometimes it can shout. Sometimes it can throw a football through the air like a myth. Sometimes it can take a character who looks ridiculous and frame him like the keeper of a sacred dream. If you enjoy underdog stories, martial arts comedy, early 2000s Hong Kong cinema, exaggerated visual style, and films that mix silliness with real emotional generosity, this one still has a lot to give you. But if your connection to cinema depends on restraint, realism, or emotional subtlety above all else, you may struggle with it. Some jokes have aged unevenly. Some supporting characters could have been deeper. Some effects now carry the visible texture of that time. And the film's tonal swings can be a lot if you are not ready for that kind of open hearted absurdity. For me, this is a film best watched with the right expectation, not as a flawless masterpiece, not as a perfectly balanced comedy, but as a bright, messy, wildly sincere piece of cinematic joy. It belongs on a big screen if you ever get the chance, because its scale, sound, and ridiculous movement deserve shared laughter. But it also works beautifully as the kind of film you discover at home, late at night, when you want something that reminds you that movies can still be playful without being hollow. Would I own it? Yes, if this style speaks to you, because Shaolin soccer is not just a one time plot experience, it is a mood you may want to return to, a reminder, a little burst of impossible confidence waiting on a shelf. My personal rating is 5.5 out of 10. And the honest sentence behind that rating is this: Shaolin soccer is uneven, rough, and sometimes clumsy, but its heart is so alive that even its flaws feel like part of its human shape. It ends like a dream that refuses to apologize for being ridiculous. A field, a team, a dreamer, a ball in motion, and somewhere inside all that chaos, a simple truth. The world may laugh before it understands, but that does not mean you are wrong to believe. If you stayed with me through this whole journey, thank you. Really, films like Shaolin Soccer are fun to talk about because they remind us that cinema is not only about perfection, it is about energy, memory, feeling, that strange moment when something absurd suddenly touches something real inside you. And now I want to hear from you. When you think about Shaolin Soccer, what stays with you most? The comedy, the football action, the Shaolin idea, or the underdog emotion underneath it all? Do you think the film still works today, or do some parts feel too tied to its time? And which Stephen Chow film do you think captures his style at its strongest? Drop your thoughts in the comments because this is one of those movies where everyone seems to remember a different impossible moment. If this essay gave you a new way to look at the film, leave a like, subscribe to the Cineflux, and stay close for the next video, where we'll step into another film and search for the feeling hidden beneath the frame. That is the Cineflux. I will see you in the next one.